What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's finally begun. We've finally gotten indexes for 10th edition Warhammer 40k, and we'll get a picture of how entire factions function. And I am out a huge amount of bribe money to the Games Workshop marketing team because they placed Tyranids at the front of the list. I went through a live review of the entire Tyranid index over on a live stream earlier today, so if you want to go check that out and see my first impressions and watch me misread some data sheets for a while.
Are they battle line? Yeah. Well, check every single data sheet, just in case I didn't read the keywords and I was talking out of my ass for like 10 consecutive minutes about how they're not battle line.
But otherwise, I'm going to talk about my picks for the biggest winners and losers from this index. Now, before we dive into it, there are a couple things that we still don't know. The first one is we don't have points values. So there are a lot of units in the index that I'm not so sure about, and my opinion could change on dramatically given their points value. But things I'm going to talk about right now, I'm either impressed or not that into, just based on the merits of their datasheet alone, whether it's their raw stats, synergies, or special abilities. So let's dive in, and in no particular order, talk about my picks for the biggest losers of this edition. The first one we have is one incredibly close to my heart. It is my favorite model in all of Warhammer 40k, the Winged Hive Tyrant. One of my favorite things about this profile in previous editions of the game has been its ability to operate in every phase. You can construct Winged Hive Tyrant builds that were good at fighting, good at shooting, good in psychic, and incredibly fast. Every facet of Warhammer 40k. It was a real skill cap unit and was incredibly fun to play with. But now they've lost basically all of that flexibility. Just like their 9th edition incarnation, they're able to equip either a ranged weapon or a melee weapon, not both, and they've entirely lost their output with psychic powers. So this means that not only do they not have a psychic ranged attack like most of the other psychers in the game do, but they also will have to choose whether or not to take a ranged weapon or any decent melee output. They also have been hammered pretty significantly on their survivability. While we did talk about vehicle and monster survivability in a recent video, they are going to be tougher to kill than they were in 9th edition. Compared to other varieties of Hive Tyrant and other monsters in the faction, they're lacking a lot. They have no ability to gain things like Lone Operative, they can't join any units, so any attacks that target them are going to target them specifically. And because this edition, unfortunately for us, uses True Line of Sight, those Winged Hive Tyrants are going to be really, really easy to spot. While their support abilities are pretty good and they're good at offensively debuffing enemies, they have been significantly debuffed in their movement. The fly keyword doesn't make you significantly more maneuverable than other units, and big monsters I think are going to have a tough time maneuvering around combats with the movement restrictions in the combat phase in this new edition. So you have a unit that does a lot less damage in melee, nothing with psychic powers or ranged attacks whatsoever, doesn't move very well, and isn't particularly survivable. So you're left asking what the point of this thing is. Moving on, a mainstay from the 9th edition Tyranid Codex, the Warriors have actually been split into two separate warrior datasheets, either the melee bioweapon warriors or the ranged bioweapon warriors. Now of the two, I'm actually a little bit more impressed by the melee bioweapons. They have an okay melee profile, high number of attacks with the twin linked ability, so they're able to get rerolls in melee, at middling AP but low damage. I do think their damage output is pretty appropriate, but all of these warriors are incredibly easy to kill. They have a low saving throw, they don't have any access to damage reduction like they did previously, and the general survivability of the faction has been reduced significantly. So while they're good in melee, they're a relatively low speed unit that's going to have a tough time actually getting there. On the flip side, the ranged bioweapon warriors just have a terrible ballistic skill. For a unit that's meant to be constructed around doing damage with ranged weapons, their selection of ranged weapons and ability to use them is uninspiring to say the least. While they do have the ability to fall back, shoot, and charge, which is pretty cool, it doesn't seem like a unit that you really want to be up towards the front line of combat, so if they're getting engaged by enemies, things are probably already going poorly for them. Not only that, but they've also lost the ability to be taken in their larger units, so you can only field units of up to 6, so attaching characters like a Tyranid Winged Prime into the unit doesn't even affect that many models, all told. Now we can stay with the kind of battle line troops theme and talk about a combination of units, the Tervagon and Termagants. Out of all of the different endless multitude units, Termagants are far and away the least useful. While they do have a cool reactive ability when enemies move close to them, they're not fast, they don't shoot well, and they aren't particularly survivable. They can only be taken in units of up to 20, so if you can ignore any defensive benefits that they have, the unit will disappear incredibly quickly, which is unfortunate for the big mama Termagant, the Tervagon, Tervagon, who's supposed to be regenerating models back to the unit. The Tervagon has had its ability to create termagants and regenerate termagants to units massively nerfed. It now regenerates D3+3 to a single unit, but can't spawn any additional units. So if that termagant unit that it's buffing gets wiped out and you don't have any other termagants that are damaged nearby, it doesn't do anything. It does grant some buff to nearby termagants, and you can get a kind of high volume of attacks out of them, but with a big monster in the middle that, while it does have a pretty strong defensive profile and can be buffed with enhancements to be even harder to kill, has no way to protect itself beyond its raw stat line. It can just be shot by enemy anti-tank and killed very quickly, unlike previous editions where it could actually be protected by termagants. So if the Tervagon is the linchpin of your game plan, it can be removed fairly quickly. It's just a whole combination of units that don't really feel like they work together. It's weird that the Tervagon doesn't either join the unit or get some sort of buff from the unit or become more defensive when it's around them. If your opponent is worried about the Tervagon regenerating termagants, they're just going to kill it, and you're not going to have that whole centerpiece. Even when buffing the termagants themselves, their profile is so uninspiring that it's not really that exciting. Last, and certainly not least, this is another one that wrenches my heart. My favorite turtle boy, the Exocrine, has been done dirty. This is one of those ones that I think could change depending on the points value, because the Exocrine does have a very cool support effect built into its datasheet. However, its primary ranged attack has been nerfed every way possible. On average, it fires less times than it did previously at a lower AP, and while its strength remained the same as it did in 9th edition, it now is going up against higher toughness values, which makes it basically useless when targeting enemy vehicles. That said, when it shoots something, it can then grant reroll 1s to hit for other friendly models that shoot that same target, which is a cool support ability. But if you're paying a bunch of points for a big stompy monster to grant reroll 1s against a single target, that's probably not going to be worth it. To compound that, it's also less survivable than other monsters in the same category as it. Things like Horospexes and Tyranofexes have significantly improved defensive profiles, whereas the Exocrine is sitting at a relatively mediocre toughness 10. I'll reverse my judgment on this guy if the Exocrine ends up being very cheap. This is a situation where, given that it is a support model that's basically buffing you against a single enemy target, if we do see a significantly reduced points cost for it, I could see the Exocrine being pretty good, but assuming that it comes in at a reasonably hefty points value, I don't think it's going to be worth playing.
All right, I wasn't sure if I wanted to add it, but then I decided after recording that I did. Let's also give an honorable mention to the Tyranid, which had its transport capacity nerfed to the point that if it embarks any monster larger than a Carnifex, it blue screens the game when they try to disembark. Like the game ends and the game state cannot progress, which is awesome.
Now that's all the negativity aside, let's talk about some cool units that got big glow-ups in 10th edition. We'll start humble and talk about the Humble Pyrovore. These guys were amazing at release in 9th edition, and not only have they retained their ability to deal damage to enemy units, but they also now have some cool support effects. The Pyrovore not only has an absolutely badass flamethrower, it's able to fire D6+1 twin-linked ignore cover torrent attacks. These are strength 6 AP1 attacks, which doesn't sound like a great profile until you remember that they're basically AP2, given that they ignore cover, and with twin-linked, they're rerolling all their wound rolls regardless of what they target. On top of that, if the Pyrovore hits you with an attack, which remember, it automatically does because of the torrent keyword, it removes cover from you for the rest of the shooting phase. And being infantry units, you can take in a unit of a single model. This targeted support effect is going to be much easier to fit into your list than a big stompy monster like an Exocrine. In 10th edition, cover is going to be a huge detriment to fighting against these vehicle units, and the Pyrovore being able to remove it automatically on a whim is super powerful. Not to mention the fact that their gun is also pretty good. Maintaining the theme of humbleness, we'll talk about a nice little battle line unit, the Tyranid Gargoyles. These guys have so many secret little abilities and use cases packed into one datasheet. Every time I look at them, I feel like I come up with another way to use this unit. Gargoyles come packaged with a Flesh Borer, which is a one-shot assault weapon, which doesn't sound that exciting until you remember that with the new mission structure rules, assault weapons allow you to advance and perform mission actions. On a unit with a base movement of 12, this means these guys can rocket across the table and score you objectives, which all by itself is huge. They're also fast and have a high OC value. They can deep strike to, again, score you those secondaries and outflank your opponent, but they also have the ability to move after shooting. And because they have an assault weapon, they can move, advance, fire their weapon, and then move again, either to get themselves to safety or to pile onto an enemy objective. It's basically like charging, but your opponent doesn't get to hit you. Of all of the endless multitude gaunt varieties we have in the index, gargoyles look far and away the most useful. Hormagaunts also look pretty good, especially at stealing enemy objectives away from them with a long threat range, but gargoyles being able to use their increased threat range and maneuver abilities to get around the table, score objectives, and disrupt your opponent's game plan, they seem like an absolute auto-include for Tyranid lists. Speaking of auto-includes, let's talk about the Lictor. Now, we already saw the Von Ryan's Leapers, and we got a little bit of a taste of the absolute terror that Lictors are going to be able to unleash on the battlefields of 10th edition, with the ability to infiltrate, block off enemy deployment zones, and always strikes first even if they charge into you, but Lictors just turn all of those abilities up to 11. One downside of the pregame screening that you're oftentimes forced to do against enemies with forward deployers, infiltrators, scouts, or turn 1 deep strikes is that you lose those units very quickly. They're going to be up ahead of your army, maybe in far corners of the table to prevent your enemy from reinforcing into those areas, and oftentimes out in the open, so they'll just get picked off by a stray las cannon or a couple of bolter rounds. But in this case, the Lictor has lone operative. It can't be attacked outside 12 inches, and even if your opponent is within 12 inches, they have stealth, so they're -1 to be hit anyway. If they charge into melee to try to deal with them, the Lictor retains that always strikes first and has an enormous number of strength 7 AP2 2 damage attacks, meaning that it's going to eviscerate an infiltrator unit or a bunch of space marines that try to charge in and kill it. On top of that, they have the precision keyword, so randomly they can scalpel characters out of units, especially lighter characters like T4, T5, 4 wound models that they just get killed in 2 conversions of the Lictor's attack, and when they do so, they gain you command points. These things have an entire smorgasbord of super duper powerful and interwoven abilities, all of which work together to make a unit that is incredibly useful. And on top of that, Tyranids now have the ability to redeploy if they take their alien cunning enhancement, forced out into the open to prevent your enemy from infiltrating, and then just redeployed back to safety under the umbrella of their lone operative effect. These models look incredibly useful, and unless they're exorbitantly priced, I can't imagine Tyranid armies without 2 or 3 of them. Now that's the little stuff out of the way. Let's talk about some big stompy monsters, or maybe in this case, slithery monsters, because we're talking about the Trigon. Now unfortunately for us, the Trigon Prime has gone the way of the Dodo in this edition. You can only take the standard version of the Trigon, but that's okay. This guy now has the ability to deep strike outside 3 inches of enemies rather than the normal 9. And while it's primarily a melee unit, and unfortunately it can't charge after that deep strike, the primary synergy here is with the rapid ingress stratagem. This stratagem is a core rollback stratagem that allows you to deep strike at the end of your opponent's movement phase, meaning that they'll move up, set up all of their screens, and trace their lines of fire, and you can just drop the Trigon almost anywhere on the table outside of significant threat. As long as you don't put it in a position where your opponent has huge lines of sight to it with lots of anti-tank weapons or big charges with powerful melee units, then it's basically going to be able to chill unmolested and just hang out for the rest of their turn. When it comes back to your turn, it has a 10-inch movement and a boatload of strength 9 AP2 3 damage attacks to clear objectives, beat up enemy tanks, or even clip an entire unit of heavy infantry. While rapid ingress is already a powerful stratagem, with the ability to deep strike 3 inches away from them, they have to have so many models to screen all of the potential drop zones for the Trigon that it's almost not even worth doing. And they might as well let the Trigon drop in your backline, get shot by a couple random bolters from some tactical marines or something, and then clear out all of their backline objectives. The success of the Trigon, in my opinion, is based almost entirely around its synergy with that rapid ingress stratagem, and if that ends up not being as powerful of a play pattern just based on the terrain or how 10th edition games roll out, I could definitely see it maybe falling a couple steps here, but I think that the threat of this big monster popping up in their backline is big enough to keep many opponents on their toes. Next up, we'll talk about 2 units that are very similar, that we've basically already seen before. The first one is Swarmlord, the other one being the Foot Hive Tyrant. Just like in 9th edition, these 2 models go together like peas in a pod, and I think that a lot of Tyranid lists are going to start with Swarmlord and a Foot Hive Tyrant. They have solid melee profiles. Their bone swords are twin linked in melee, giving them melee rerolls, and they're pretty good at closing out games, especially against not super heavily armored vehicles. T8 or T9 vehicles or heavy infantry will get cleared out by these dudes, and the classic Hive Tyrant can mount a variety of ranged weapons to help them along the way. But the most important thing is that these guys have the Will of the Hive Mind ability. This gives you Gilliman's free stratagem aura. They're just Rabute Gilliman, but a bug. Space Marine players are going to love the fact that they can use a bunch of stratagems for free with the combination of Rabute Gilliman, giving them a free stratagem during their turn and their opponent's turn, and then another one from a Captain's Rites of Battle, and you basically get that with Tyranids. The Swarm Lord not only makes your opponent's stratagems worse, but also grants you a command point for free every single one of your command phases, and the Hive Tyrant gets you 2 free stratagems. Again, just like Gilliman, 1 in your turn and 1 in your opponent's turn. That's a potential savings of 5 command points a turn on top of the ones that you are going to be getting for your Battleforged CP bonus. If you use a 2 CP stratagem in your turn and a 2 CP stratagem in your opponent's turn, that's already 4 CP you got for free, plus Swarm Lord granting you 1 on top of that. While these big monsters aren't lone operatives, they are able to join resilient Tyrant Guard units to keep them around for long and ensure that they make it to the late game and continue to give you those free stratagems over the course. And being only 10 wounded monsters now, they don't even degrade. Even if they take damage from precision weapons over the course of the game, you have to actually kill them to stop them from hitting you with all of their big attacks at full strength. And that is scary. Now, last but certainly not least, let's talk about everyone's favorite unit archetype in Tyranids, the Carnifex. Not that dumb Screamer Killer. Get that guy out of here. The old school Beetle Carnifex is back in a big way, and with their special character, Old One-Eye. Carnifexes are back as a multi-model unit. You can take them in broods of up to 2 with whatever combination of war gear your little Tyranid mind can come up with. Now, while the Carnifexes themselves are pretty impressive, they're only weapon skill and ballistic skill 4, which is unfortunate, but they get some very high damage weapons. Their Crushing Claws are effectively strength 14 las cannons, and these little Carnifexes actually boast some of the strongest melee attacks in the entire faction. They also have the ability to move after being shot by enemy ranged attacks, which makes them incredibly fast getting up the table as long as you're confident that your opponent isn't gonna kill you. That said, they can also be buffed by Old One-Eye joining the team. With a slightly more resilient Carnifex profile, that brings their total number up to 3, a grand total of 27 2+ save wounds, with Old One-Eye being granted the ability to regenerate wounds and ignore damage on a 5, meaning that hitting him with precision weapons doesn't even guarantee that you're gonna kill him. And if you don't kill him, he'll just heal and the unit will keep on trucking and probably charge you. He also grants all of those Carnifexes rerolls to hit with all of their attacks, both melee and ranged. So taking a combination melee and ranged unit can get you a ton of free rerolls and actually make those low accuracy Carnifex weapons much more reliable. Even if Old One-Eye just gets there by himself, he's still got 6 strength, 14 AP3, D6+1 damage crushing claw attacks. It's been a really long time since these classic Carnifexes, and especially the character Old One-Eye, have been good enough to see the table, and I'm crossing my fingers that the points are going to be right to be able to include a unit of 2 Carnifexes and Old One-Eye himself in most Tyranid builds. Because whether or not they're leading the charge, getting all your defensive buffs and trying to absorb as much fire as possible from your opponent's army, or acting as a late game anchor, shooting early game and then coming in to close things out in melee in the mid to late game. Either way, this unit looks incredibly strong and super difficult to deal with. And with that, that is all of my picks for the biggest winners and losers from the Tyranid Codex. There's a lot to go through in here, and Tyranids have changed monumentally as a faction from their 9th edition incarnation. There's some combinations in here that I'm pretty excited about, and a lot of stuff I'm waiting for the points on to make final judgment. So it's going to be an exciting next couple of days while we wait with bated breath. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.